Awesome. Thank you for coming tonight. I'm Jessica Bickford. I'm the coordinator of Healthy Lamoille Valley. We're a substance prevention coalition. We know our numbers are a little less tonight because there's some people that had sniffles and colds, and they decided that they would err on the side of precaution. So I was getting emails right up to like 10 minutes ago saying, I'm not going to make it. Are you recording it? We are recording it, so those who can't make it can see it, as well as those who you can share it out with all of those people. So as I mentioned, I'm with Healthy Lamoille Valley. We're a substance prevention coalition. We've been doing this work for about 20 years in the region, just over. And on the back table is just kind of a one-page about some of the projects that we do. On your seat, there's a few things I'd like to draw your attention to. You have index cards. We're going to have a question and answer time later. So feel free to write down your questions, and we'll collect those, and that way nobody has to be on the spot to ask those questions. You have a parent info card. If you have kids in your life that you're working with, this card and this website is an awesome gift. It's something that you can go to, and it kind of gives you fresh ideas of how to have ongoing conversations with youth, and so they stay fresh. We have the Let's Talk Cannabis campaign, and this is just an informational campaign from the Vermont Department of Health. So they have a website they'll be continually updating, but we also wanted to print this out so you have that information going home. It's a great thing to share with a friend or neighbor or colleague. And then finally, we have our survey. This just helps us be able to offer more events and offer them in a way that you as a community want. As I mentioned, Healthy Lamoille Valley is a coalition, and a coalition is a group of people that come together around a common purpose. And so tonight, you're all here to learn more about cannabis and how it's impacting our youth. And so thank you. Your role in the community, being even just a friend or conversation, in conversation, sharing that out is super important. So thank you. I'm going to introduce Michelle Salvador. She's our co-collaborator with the Department of Health, and she's going to share a little bit about our local data just to kind of frame the conversation before Brad comes on.
Thanks, Jessica. So you're the Corona brave, huh? So like Jessica said, I'm Michelle Salvador. I am the region's substance prevention consultant for the past 22 or so years. So I work with communities and help them develop readiness to address issues pertaining to substance misuse. This is actually, these pictures, I go around often and collect pictures of how substances show up in our communities. And I do it through the lens of my 11-year-old son. And this was actually Youth Day down at the Montpelier Farmers Market. So I want to preface Brad's presentation by sharing with you some of our state and local data to put things in perspective for you before we hear from Brad about some things he's seeing in Colorado. So this is the percentage of Vermonters 12 and older using marijuana in the past month, and you'll see it is consistently higher than the national average, okay? So we are higher than Colorado, where they have commercialization. We are number one. Both Vermont and the United States have had significant increases in use across all age groups, contrary to the myth that we often hear that, oh no, the numbers haven't gone up and youth aren't using anymore. This is just not factual. And I just want to make a note, show you in the data, you can see where Vermont decriminalized marijuana, okay? And then over here, 2018, 17, 18 is when legal possession, when we passed legal possession in Vermont. So here you can see how Vermont's past month use is higher overall, okay? So the Vermont is the green, And the purple in the center is the entire Northeast. So it's like Pennsylvania, Connecticut, the whole Northeast. We are higher than the average of the entire Northeast and higher than the average in the United States. We rank first for past month use of marijuana use for young people 12 to 17, and we rank first for use for 18 to 25-year-olds, and for 26 and above, we're second in the nation. So here you can see how, just in a map of the United States, how we compare to other states. So we have very similar but higher levels already than states like Colorado and Washington, as I said, that have legal and commercialized markets. So just to look at young people a bit, let's break it down a little bit. This is looking at 12 to 17-year-olds use in Vermont compared to use across the United States. And the red numbers you see on that top line, they represent a statistically significant increase in use. And the green number is when we see a decrease in use that is statistically significant. And again, you see we are the highest in the nation. This is use of all age groups in Vermont. Okay, so the blue line sort of down there at the bottom is 12 to 17. That top line is 18 to 25. And that kind of lime green line is ages 26 plus. So this is Vermonters 18 to 25 using at like the highest rates in the nation. And it's really important. The only reason I note this is because the brain is not done developing till around age 25. So this is a group of people that are also at risk of putting themselves at risk for a future of substance use dependency. Now, this is our local Lamoille data, okay? And I want to say we have the results of our 2019 Youth Risk Behavior Survey, but the local data hasn't been released yet. So far, we only have the statewide report, okay? So this is just to 2017. And we are pretty similar to the rest of Vermont with our adolescent marijuana use. However, in that 26% is likely very low after having looked at the 2019 Youth Risk Behavior Survey data for the whole state. So in the state, marijuana use increased significantly past 30-day use of 9th to 12th graders. It went from 24% in 2017, and it has increased to 27% in 2019. So we'll be curious to see what happens with our local Lamoille data. It's also important to note is that among current marijuana users, vaping is using the vaping, and when we say vaping, it's really just using the device, right? You vape different substances out of it, but vaping as the primary method of use significantly increased more than 8 times, from 2% in 2017 to 17% in 2019. So this is definitely a route of administration. So use, and again, the 2017 data, and you'll see what I want to point out to you is marijuana use before the age of 13. We are worse in statistical comparison, excuse me, to the rest of the state. And why this is concerning is because of brain development. So young people who use before the age of 15, they're 6 times more likely to develop dependency in their lifetime than someone who has delayed use until, say, after age 25, because they are changing what's going on. They're predisposing themselves to later problems in life. And so this really is the focus of much of our work, trying to delay that onset of use. And I want to point out too that our rate of alcohol use among 9th to 12th graders in Lamoille before the age of 13 is 20% versus 14% of the rest of the state. So we have a very significant early use problem here in Lamoille of our young people. This is current alcohol, tobacco, and marijuana use, okay? So these are statewide numbers. And I want to impart on you that there are many factors that contribute to young people using early in life. One is the access and the availability of substances, okay? So when we have more substance available, more young people are using, more people are using substances. Another is the perception of how harmful people think substances are. So if I don't think it's very harmful, then I'm more likely to use marijuana, alcohol, etc. Another is that our community laws and norms support use. Okay, so you'll see, I know I've taken my son to birthday parties and all the adults are drinking at little children's birthday parties. We see local nonprofits, human service folks having fundraisers with alcohol. We see at our farmers markets people drinking. You see at the Montpelier Farmers Market free cannabis out on the picnic table where kids were sitting and listening to music. So I think, I challenge you when you leave here to, I think sometimes we don't notice these things, right? Because we don't notice what we don't think about. And so I challenge you to look around in the community and just see how many times every day you are seeing messages in our community that are really promoting use. And our young people are seeing those messages every single day, and these things are impacting them. So another important risk factor is whether young people think that their parents think it's wrong, and that's really what I want to leave you with. So if you look at this, as use goes up, as youth use goes up, youth who think that their parents think it's wrong for them to use goes down, okay? And as youth use goes down, rates of parents who disapprove goes up, okay? So if you see here, see alcohol sort of trending down, okay? And marijuana trending upward. This is the parental disapproval. So marijuana, okay? Less kids than before think that their parents think it's wrong. More kids think their parents think it's wrong for them to use alcohol. So if nothing else, what you talk to your kids about and setting a clear and consistent expectations around use really is one of the most powerful things that we can do for our young people. And I think that's about the end. So I wanted to now pass it over to Dr. Brad Roberts, who's going to take, these are just statistics here, but he's going to take some of his statistics from Colorado and, let me get my thing unplugged, and put some stories behind that from his ER.
Can I just ask a quick question?
Sure.
In one of your earlier charts, you
Yeah.
showed the use of marijuana going down, and then in the year that it became legalized, all of a sudden it trends up.
Yes.
I assume that's the effect of that.
Correlation.
Right.
Yep, correlation. Exactly. And we also can see we do not have any state dollars that go into prevention. All of our prevention money is federal grants that we are, and sometimes some in-state private grants, but generally federal grants that we apply for as it comes available. And there's a correlation within the data where you can see when we have some federal funds and when we don't have some federal funds and when we have them, et cetera.
Thank you.
Good question, thank you. Okay, Brad. You're up.
All right, and I'm not much of a podium guy. I kind of like to walk around a little bit and be free, so I'm going to step out in front. If you can't hear me, can everybody hear me? It's not a big group. You guys can hear me? Who's in the room? Do I have parents? Lots of parents, grandparents? Youth? I'm going to define youth. I really like you said brain development was about 25. Some studies are even showing it goes out to about 30, somewhere between 25 and 30. Your brain's still developing by functional MRI studies. So who's still a youth? All right, good. Well, I want to just say, I think it's incredible you guys came here tonight. I know everybody's time is valuable. You've got a lot going on. If you got sports, you've got sports to watch, you've got other kids' concerts to go to, you got a lot of things going on. So thanks for coming here tonight. I'm very impressed by people that would come out here, so I'm glad you're here. I'm going to start by just introducing myself. So this is me and my family. My wife Kirsten actually came out tonight. Actually, this is I do give these talks all the time. I think this is the first one she's been to, but she came out with me to Vermont. These are my kids, age 9, 7, and 4. I'm from Pueblo, Colorado. That's where I was born and raised. I grew up there. I left for 13 years to finish all my schooling. And then, although I swore I'd never move back, I decided I actually quite liked Pueblo, and I moved back. So that's where I live and practice. As she mentioned, I'm an emergency medicine physician. We work at a busy level 2 trauma center. We have a large catchment area for all of southeastern Colorado. So why am I here talking about cannabis? I never thought in a million years that I would be the marijuana guy heading out to other states to talk about marijuana. That's never what I thought. I really enjoyed critical care. What that means is people who are really sick. I like talking about how to make them better. I like talking about things we do to save lives, because that's kind of what my job is in the ER a lot of the times, is kind of saving lives. What happened is I got moved back to Colorado, and I had worked I'd done my residency in Albuquerque, a big level 1 trauma center. And I like to tell people that Breaking Bad, if anybody's seen that, was filmed there for a reason. We had plenty. And I got to Pueblo, which is a lot smaller town. There's about 160,000 people in Pueblo. Albuquerque's got, I think, 5 million. I don't know the exact population, much bigger. And there were things I was seeing in the ER that I had never seen before. And what I noticed is a lot of them had urine drug screens that were only positive for cannabis, or were telling me they were using cannabis. And I guess I made the mistake of getting on PubMed, that's where they have a lot of the academic journals, and typed in cannabis and started reading a lot of the academic articles that were out there. At the time, 3 years ago, we were doing kind of what you're doing now. We were there actually probably more like 4 years ago. And so I thought, I've just learned all this really interesting stuff. And I was fresh out of residency and maybe somewhat innocent. And I wrote a little article on our newspaper that I thought people might find interesting. Suddenly it had thousands of shares on Facebook. I was being reached out to from people from California and all over the country that had read my article. I started getting asked to go and give talks everywhere. I then got asked by the editor-in-chief for the Western Journal of Emergency Medicine to write a big review article on it. I think that's why I'm here tonight, is because one of the physicians in Vermont had found that article. And actually part of the reason I'm here tonight, I assume, is this last October, we were on vacation with Trek Travel. They do a bicycling tour, and they took us through Vermont. And so we were cycling through Vermont. And literally, while we were here, one of the physicians who had seen my article said, "Hey, I wonder if you could come out to Vermont to talk to us." And so I literally said, "Well, I'm actually here right now. Just happens to be." So we went and met with her before we went to the airport over in Burlington. And I think that's why I'm back here tonight. So kind of a happenstance. So kind of get into it. If you have burning questions, I'm okay with being interrupted, but I'm going to try to get through it as fast as we can. We'll do the index cards, but I want to make sure that you feel included and that we're all together. We're going to do a few things. So I'm not going to start out. The other thing that I do substance abuse talks not just on marijuana. I go to middle schools and high schools, and I talk to the students about substance abuse in general. And I'm going to build a framework around how substance abuse works in general before we get just to marijuana, because I think that's pretty relevant. We're going to talk about kind of how it works. We're going to talk about how it affects learning, and then we're going to get to marijuana. So substance dependence. Oh, it looks like my slides got cut off. There's several parts to it. We don't need to go through all of this, but there's a tolerance. In other words, that I need to use more and more of it to have the same effect. There's a withdrawal, so if I suddenly stop using it, I get withdrawal symptoms. So people in alcohol withdrawal get really shaky. People in opiate withdrawal get really achy, dilated pupils. They feel miserable, start throwing up. Usually we'll end up taking the substance in larger amounts over a longer period of time than was expected. And that if you you have this persistent desire or unsuccessful attempts to cut down or control your substance use. That's kind of the definition of dependence. I really like this. I just found this on Google. This is kind of when the substance actually owns your brain, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. Addiction, not to go through this whole thing, it's essentially when that substance dependence starts developing a problem. To the point you start missing school, you start missing work, you start getting in fights with your family members over it, you start driving impaired. That's when you really start getting into the addiction part. This is one of my favorite characters of addiction. If anybody's seen The Lord of the Rings, you know who that is? Gollum. That's your definition of addiction right there. He cannot think or cannot do anything else other than be addicted to the ring that has him. So how does it work? There's chemicals in your brain that actually have to do with addiction and correlate with how addiction works. One of the biggest ones is dopamine. And dopamine, what it does is it's actually a natural reward. It says to your body that when you do something, this is a good thing. You should do it again. When we eat, we have surges of dopamine and you feel good. And your body says, that's a really good thing. I should eat again. When you exercise, you have a surge in dopamine. When you get a hug, you actually have a surge in dopamine. All of these things that are good, natural things that you need to do to carry on and do well in life, you get surges of dopamine. Addiction actually hijacks that system. And the way that kind of works is I just kind of made this graph myself, but, sorry, it cut me off a little bit. But if you look here, this is kind of where it says I feel bad, I feel normal, and I feel great. And so as we kind of go throughout life, most of us will oscillate somewhere around here. We might have a good birthday party or something happen, and we feel really good, and sometimes something bad happens, and we feel kind of bad, but we kind of oscillate here in the middle. Well, with substance abuse, the first time you use, you get this huge dopamine surge. Your brain just releases tons of dopamine. When that happens, you do feel good. The problem is you can't sustain that, so you run out, and people drop, and you feel really bad. People don't like feeling bad, and so what they do is they eventually use again to try to get back up. But you still don't have that amount of dopamine in your brain, and so you drop back down. And so you use again, and you use again. And what I'll hear all of my patients say, and I should apologize, I'm going to backtrack. I do have another job. I actually am what's called X-waivered, meaning I prescribe medications to treat substance dependence as well. I kind of work at a substance abuse clinic. And what my patients tell me is that the first time I used it felt great. After that, I had to use just to feel normal. And they'll call it, I'm always chasing the dragon. I'm always trying to feel normal again. And they're stuck down here. Nobody wants to feel bad, and you'll do anything to get out of there. And now those substances own you. This is a more complex way of looking at it. What I want to get out of this is that there's lots of areas that are involved in that pathway. That pathway involves areas of the brain that control your habits, your routines, your emotions, your prefrontal cortex, which is the way you think and the way you judge different reactions. And so as you go, you develop these very significant patterns. So people will say, all I had to do was smell it. All I had to do was see it. And it triggers that whole cycles back again. Those memories, those emotions, those actions that you did are all hardwired into the brain. I just put this up here to say, I'm simplifying this. There are whole years people will send in school. So in case you were saying, well, there's a lot more to it, yes, there's a lot more to it. I'm not going to go into all that. This is what I was kind of talking about, though. So these brains, these are functional MRI studies. On the bottom here, these brains are all normal brains. And what we're looking at is the red is dopamine. That's how much dopamine's in a brain. The top brains are all brains that are suffering from addiction. So whether it's smoking, alcohol, obesity, cocaine, you could actually throw marijuana on the same list. You can see their dopamine's gone. There's no dopamine there. And the real part I want to get out of this is if I'm in business to make money off of addiction, and I have all of these customers out here, this is where I want you. I own you now. You have to use, and I get to make money because you want out of this so bad that you're going to use every second you get. And if I get you down here every time you use, I make money. So to the youth who are out there, you represent business. So drug use and the effects on learning. This is a test that they did. This is called the mouse Morris water maze. And what they did is they put this mouse and you drop it in a bucket of water and you put a platform. Mice don't like being in water and they really want to get out of it. And so they put these visual cues, a square, a circle, a triangle that are different colors, And at first, the mouth swims around and around and around the platform until it finally finds it. Well, if I drop that mouse in a second time, it remembers. It can see where the triangle and the square and the circle are. It swims right to the platform and it gets out. But if I give that mouse a drug, and it actually doesn't matter what the drug is, I can put it in there again and again and again, and it doesn't learn. You've hijacked that entire learning system of your brain, and you actually can't learn. It affects what's called the hippocampus and your ability to make new memories. And it doesn't matter if it's alcohol, cocaine, methamphetamines, marijuana, heroin, nicotine, alcohol, they all do the same thing. They impact your ability to learn new things. 9 out of 10 people with substance abuse problems started using by the age of 18. We're going to move on a little bit to the marijuana portion of it. So I put a lot of things. Marijuana's got a lot of different names, and we've all decided that we need to name it different things, whether it's marijuana, cannabis, weed, pot, dope. We're all talking about the same thing. I may use varying terms during this presentation. That's not to mean I'm talking about different things. That's just there's lots of different names for it. Just a little bit of an introduction. Cannabis is a kind of a complex plant. We typically talk about 2 substances. We talk about THC or CBD, but there's actually about 483 different compounds in it. And counting, they're still discovering more. The main active ones are THC or tetrahydrocannabidiol or cannabidiol CBD. Those are the ones you've heard of. There's lots of different plant strains. In my opinion, we don't do marijuana much justice by calling it just marijuana. There's lots of different chemicals in it. There's lots of different plant varieties, and each of these plant varieties have different chemical compounds in it. So the most common are cannabis indica and cannabis sativa. You can see they actually look quite a bit different. So the indicas are a much more bushy, lower to the ground plant that you see on the left, where the sativas are a lot higher. Hemp is actually a form of cannabis sativa. And generally speaking, the indica have high THC to CBD ratios, and the sativa have high CBD to THC ratios. Again, not much there other than to be aware of when you hear those terms. That's what people are talking about. You do have cannabinoid receptors throughout your body. The molecules are part of this broader endocannabinoid system in your body. And these receptors are kind of actually distributed throughout your body. You have some in the brain, in your GI tract, your reproductive system, your immune tissues. The 2 main receptors, you have a CB1 and a CB2 receptor. The CB1 receptors are mainly located in the brain, the CB2 receptors in the rest of the body. That's not to say that you need cannabinoids, exogenous or external cannabinoids. You don't need to take marijuana. The system wasn't built for marijuana. You actually have a natural molecule your body produces. It's called anandamide. And anandamide binds to these receptors in your body. And that's really what it's used for. However, we've looked at a lot of things. When you modulate or you try to interact with this system, you can produce changes. And that's really what we're talking about when we talk about both the adverse, and people will talk about the medicinal benefits as part of marijuana. So today's cannabis, the potency is dramatically increased from what it was. We're now at about 20% tetrahydrocannabidiol or 20% THC. That's the psychoactive ingredient, the part that gets people high. Back in the 70s and 80s, we used to be talking about 2 to 3% THC. And I like to emphasize, this is just in the native plant. This is the plant itself that's been genetically modified to produce these larger values. And I like to point out, people tend to well, I don't get that, that just sounds a lot. It's not double, it's not triple, it's not quadruple. You're talking 10 times the amount of THC in it. Then you take that, and you can actually use solvents to extract the THC out of it. So this is actually one of the extracting units that they use to take that THC out. And you can use it to make all these different formulations. So a joint is just taking the flower, you roll it up, and then you smoke it. That's a typical joint. But you can extract it to create these oils. You can dry that oil out to make what's called shatter. And then you can dissolve it, and you can inhale it, whether that be through a bong or a vaping device. Or you can take it and solidify it and put it on the end of a nail. And this here is what's called a dabbing rig. These are called dabs. And you use a blowtorch, and you can get up to 99% THC. One of the other, and so if you actually, the other thing is, so if you've got this oil, you can make stuff. It's just like vegetable oil or any other kind of oil. You can bake with it. So you can make cookies and brownies and candies, and these are what we call edibles. The other thing that you can make, so I was told, so Carl's Jr. Is a big chain. It's kind of like McDonald's. I guess I was talking about it this morning, and you don't have them in Vermont. But we do in Colorado. It's like a big McDonald's fast food chain. And this is a real ad we did on 420, have a Rocky Mountain High cheeseburger that was in Colorado. One of the other things I wanted to kind of go back for a second, one of the other differences, so as part of an emergency medicine, I always take what's called a social history. That means I ask my patients, do you smoke? How much do you smoke? Do you drink? How much do you drink? But in the training, we had only asked, do you use other substances? Do you use marijuana, meth, cocaine, heroin? And they all got lumped together with a yes or no answer. The other change that's happened is, I think people at like Woodstock would smoke half a joint and they'd pass it around the circle once a month. Now when I've asked my patients, how much do you smoke when they say yes to marijuana, it's 8 joints a day, and that's legitimately what a lot of my patients are telling me. So not only are you having 10 times the amount of potency, you are now smoking 8 joints a day for a lot of these patients instead of the half a joint once a month. It's a much different version that we're talking about now. I put this in there kind of after the fact because I understand in the current iteration, the advertising was kind of a big deal in the way Vermont's going about it right now. I really find it's so funny because that's where we were 4 or 5 years ago. It was all about there will be no advertising. We're going to cut out the advertising. Well, fast forward 5 years later, this is a full-page ad in our newspaper. This is actually, there's a restaurant called Black Eyed Pea. It's kind of like a home cooking restaurant. It's a chain-like place as well. We went there for my dad's birthday. This is off of my cell phone sitting next to the table with my kids. That's for Rocky Mountain Blaze. It's kind of one of those scrolling screens that was right next to our restaurant table. And obviously the t-shirts, they can kind of get away with that because that's not really advertising. You're just sort of putting a slogan on there. So we're going to go into the actual, what are the adverse health effects of cannabis use? So there's a number of them that we're going to that are pretty well researched. Psychosis, suicide. There's a lot of adverse effects on brain function and brain structure. So depressed ability in decision-making capacity, learning, memory, social interaction, IQ. You have increases in impulsivity, anxiety, depression, and abnormalities in your habits and routines. Links to other substance abuse. People do get dependent on it, and people do have defined withdrawal symptoms, so they do actually really fit that substance dependence. A lot of the patients that I see, we're going to talk about these adverse effects, and when it comes down to asking them to stop using them, a lot of them I found actually have a really hard time stopping using, even when they're having a lot of the problems we're going to talk about. Cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome, that just means people throw up a lot. You have poor respiratory and cardiovascular outcomes. If you use it during pregnancy, there's low birth weight and growth restriction in the fetus. Preterm labor and developmental problems, we're just now starting to understand those. Decreased ability to operate a motor vehicle. Burn injuries and preparation of concentrates. I don't have slides on it for this particular group, but that's something that you may not realize. So that means if I'm taking butane, which is like a solvent, and I use that to extract it in a home grow, that can explode. And I've actually seen several patients who have had horrible burn injuries needing to be flown out to our burn center as a result of some of those explosions. And then our pediatric things, there's lots of other things in it, contaminants, whether that be pesticides or fertilizers that they've added into it. There's a new field, this epigenomics, that's just starting to be understood. So one of the things we're realizing is it actually can alter the genome and is being passed on to subsequent generations. That's not to go there other than to say FYI, that's something that I think is on the horizon we'll start to hear more about later. I'm always criticized when I give my high school and middle school presentations that you need to speak English. I don't know if that's the right word. So I'm going to try to do that a little bit. So if you don't hear anything else, this is the summary, and then the rest of this is going to be data kind of backing this up. So marijuana damages your brain. It can make you become psychotic. It can make it difficult to think and make good decisions. It can make you more likely to kill yourself, i.e. suicide. Marijuana can prime your brain to make you more likely to experience addiction. Marijuana can make you throw up a lot. And our medications we have in the ER can't fix that. Marijuana makes it so you can't react as soon and makes you less aware of what is happening around you, and marijuana users are more likely to hurt themselves or somebody else in a car accident. And then marijuana use costs the healthcare system, which is everybody in here who pays taxes, a lot of money. And we're going to go into some of that. So this is out of Colorado. This is looking at our children's hospital. These are youth visits by year with a cannabis-related diagnosis code. So you can see steadily increasing trend. The second bar there is how many of these youth visits got a mental health evaluation, and you can see it's well over 50% of those emergency visits actually got a mental health evaluation as part of their emergency visit. Mental health is by far the biggest problem that I see with it. It's what I see in the emergency department every single day that I work. And if you look at it, this is out of that same paper where that graph came from. What they did is they took out of 7,432,000 patients, and they split them up with those that have a marijuana-related diagnosis code and those without a marijuana-related diagnosis code. And then they looked at these like prevalence ratios of which kind of diagnosis thing fit with those codes. And what you'll see is that there really wasn't a huge correlation until you got to mental illness, and then there was a 5-fold increase in your prevalence ratio that went with marijuana. So one of the biggest things we see is psychosis. Psychosis is a hard term. I don't know the best definition for it. When you see it, you see it. Psychotic is part of it. It just means they're kind of going crazy. They're having active hallucinations and active paranoia as part of that spectrum. So what is that? What does that look like? So there's a few cases that these are my personal cases. These are patients I saw. A 22-year-old kid came in, no previous medical or psychiatric history. He came in after he had tried to hang himself by a ceiling fan with his bed sheet at a motel. The manager found him, called 911, and our paramedics brought him in. He stated that he was seeing ghosts that were telling him to do that, and that's why he did it. He also said he was smoking weed all day, every day. No other psychiatric history, no other medical problems, and the only thing on his urine drug screen that he was positive for was cannabis. Another one is an 18-year-old kid. He was at kind of an inspirational camp. He actually had a Division I football scholarship. He took off driving 120 miles an hour from the camp. His buddy that was with him tried to chase after him. Fortunately, the car broke down, and the buddy was able to bring him back in and bring him back into our emergency department. When he got in, he was rambling, literally did not make any sense. We couldn't get him to keep his clothes on. And after about a week of inpatient psychiatric treatment, they still had a hard time getting him to keep his clothes on. The only positive finding on his lab work was a urine drug screen positive for cannabis. No other psychiatric history, other than the family said he had been dealing with a little bit of anxiety lately, and it said that he had used magic mushrooms. So a couple other parts to it. Yeah?
One of the things that we hear a lot about in Vermont is the inability to just road test for intoxication, quote unquote. But what you're talking about are very extreme cases that, what I'm wondering is, are there numbers related to those urine samples that sort of correlate with this high level of toxicity that could show? You know what I'm saying? Is that in present time? I know it's hard to do with residual effects, but in these cases, does it show at astronomical rates off the scale?
So when I first started getting into this, that's the first thing I said is, let's get the data for our psychosis cases. I want to know, because that's the biggest thing. That's the thing that worries me. That's the thing that made me say, I've never seen this before. What's happening? The hard part is there's at least 20 plus ICD-10 codes, so the codes we use for diagnosis that could put in, and there's no specific code for psychosis itself. So it might range from bipolar disorder with mania, it might just be acute mania, it might be major depressive disorder with manic symptoms or with psychotic symptoms. It might be just get labeled as cannabis abuse, and that's the end of it. So the diagnosis codes weren't consistent to actually track the numbers was one of the hardest parts. The other thing is most standard ERs don't actually check like how much cannabinoids in there. You need an expanded urine drug screen. We're just getting a positive or negative.
So that data is not being made, collected, correlated in any significant way?
Right now, as long as our ICD-10 codes don't have psychosis as a diagnostic category, then you're not getting it. So last one here I've got, and just so you're aware, these actually are cases. Right before I came out here, my coworker that was talking to was telling him I was coming out here and what I was doing to talk about, and he said, yeah, I just had 3 cases yesterday. These are something that we see pretty much daily. Of some case similar to this. This is a 16-year-old kid. He'd come in after he had tried to assault actually other members of his household. He then had taken a utility knife and cut down his arm. When he came in, he was just staring blankly ahead. He didn't interact with me. He didn't look at me. He just stared blankly ahead. I put over 48 stitches in his arm. We put another 50 plus steri strips up and down his arm. The whole time just stared. Again, no other medical problems, no previous psychiatric history, urine drug screen only positive for cannabis. And I've got a lot more that we could talk about. And that's kind of what this says. I don't see anything that seems to correlate. It seems to span age ranges. I do think it seems to correspond much more with younger people, and what the data bear out is the younger you start to use, the more frequent you use, and the higher the potency you use, the more likely you are to experience it. The best I've seen comes out of studies out of Scandinavia. They they say about 13% of users will experience it. Again, that's out of the Scandinavian literature. The unifying I've seen thing with all of these is that they all use marijuana. I actually like this quote from Green Day. I'm probably dating myself, but that's who I like to listen to in high school. Am I just paranoid or am I just stoned? It's actually in a lot of the music that talks about marijuana. Paranoia is actually just part of the spectrum. A lot of people will say, yeah, I know I get a little bit paranoid when I use weed. But what happens is what people don't realize is that paranoia, meaning that I believe that my neighbors are spying on me or the government's out to get me, eventually leads to action. And that's where people come into the ER. If you truly believe that your neighbor's trying to do things to you, a lot of times that's when they're coming into the ER. This isn't just me. There's actually some of the largest evidence on cannabis. So the major review by the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, as well as the World Health Organization and our own Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, have all independently come to the same conclusion. This is a quote from that National Academies paper, that there is substantial evidence of a statistical association between cannabis use and the development of schizophrenia or other psychoses with the highest risk among the most frequent users. Direct quote. Suicide. It's the #1 cause of death in Colorado for individuals between the age of 10 and 24. This is a copy and paste from a newspaper article that Children's Hospital Colorado has seen the number of patients who have attempted suicide soar 600% since 2009. These are our numbers. The green line is just total suicides, and the blue line is suicides with marijuana positive on toxicology. We, for all intents and purposes, legalized in 2011, right here. That's when we started, actually, the Ogden Memorandum came out, which allowed people to start creating dispensaries for medical marijuana. Our recreational actually happened here in 2014. This is if we just take that suicides with marijuana positive as a percentage. So you can see, again, same kind of increases as not only did the total suicides go up, but even still, those with positive marijuana for suicide still went up significantly as a percent. Again, the research shows that data fairly significantly. These are what's called odds ratios. It just means you're significantly more likely to have suicidal ideation, suicide attempts, or suicide completion if you're using cannabis. Links to other substance abuse. So I know this gets hotly debated, like out in the Google universe or out in the people discussing it. I don't think it's very much debated when you're talking in the actual medical literature. This is pretty well established. Again, the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, the World Health Organization, and the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment all found the same conclusion of a statistical association between cannabis use and the development of substance dependence or substance abuse disorder. You can take twin studies, so these discordant twin studies. That means I have two identical twins that were kind of separated at birth, and the twin that used marijuana was significantly more likely to use other substances compared to the other twins. And those 4 studies were all in different areas across the globe and at different time frames that all showed the same finding. I can look at animal models. So if I give rats THC, they're significantly more likely to push the button for opiates and nicotine after they've been given THC. We can actually look at their brains, so I can actually do like an MRI study of their brain and see actual changes to the parts of the brain that control addiction. And this is one of the most interesting studies that I found. If I take a rat and I genetically modify it, so if I cut out that CBD or that CB1 receptor, that receptor in the brain that THC bound to, if I cut that out and give them morphine, they didn't have the same response. Not only that, if I give them a ton of morphine and then I give them Narcan, they didn't have any withdrawal symptoms, which I thought was extremely interesting. To me, I think there actually is something different to the way our THC is interacting with our brain and the way that affects our substance abuse, more than just they're around it, so they're going to be more likely to use philosophy. This is our Colorado data. This is our overdose deaths by substances by year. Again, 2011 right here is where we essentially legalized. 2014 is where our recreational legalized. This top one is our prescription opiates. This light blue one, again, 2011 right here, that's our meth overdose deaths. And then we have heroin right here, and then cocaine and fentanyl kind of moving up at the end of our chart there. This is actually my own hospital. So if I took my own hospital where I work, I took their urine drug screens by year. The number of tests we were getting per patient is essentially the same, but we went from having about 47% of those positive to 61% positive, so a jump from 273 a month positive to 389. If we look at our cannabis, about a 56% increase. Our opiates had about a 10% increase, and our meth went up 143% from about 53 per month to 129 per month positive.
Does that discern between prescribed and non-prescribed?
It does not. This is just a straight opiate positive blank drug screen. Cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome, that's a fancy word for meaning people throw up a lot. People call this scromiting. You should look up videos of this. It's horrid. These people are retching and screaming at the same time. It's quite noisy. The whole ER can hear them. So just to kind of, the symptoms are significant nausea, violent vomiting, and abdominal pain in the setting of chronic cannabis use. The cardinal diagnostic characteristics include regular cannabis use, cyclic nausea and vomiting, and compulsive hot baths or showers with resolution of symptoms. We actually don't know why hot showers seem to fix it, but one of the only treatments I have in the ER that works is to give them a hot shower, because none of the other medications we work. So we have a lot of medications that we use for normal nausea and vomiting, and they're fairly effective. I use them all the time, but I can't get these to be better. One of the only things that's actually being done is we give them Haldol, which is this heavy sedative, or Valium until we can knock them out enough that they stop. That's really the only things I've found to be effective. Because of how bad they are, they get a lot of studies. These people look bad when they come in. So as an ER doctor, do they have a small bowel obstruction? Do they have an electrolyte problem that's causing it? Maybe they have a gallbladder issue. So they get huge workups. They get lots of imaging studies in the form of CAT scans, ultrasounds, lab work. They eventually get admitted. They get endoscopies. And we're giving them lots of medications to try to treat it because it's awful and we want to help them feel better. Most of the time, these studies are non-diagnostic and our treatment's not very effective. Again, what I have found is the only thing that really works is sedating them enough to get it to stop. This is at my hospital.
How long is the duration of symptoms for that?
So this is just anecdotally, it tends to be 2 or 3 days. This is just a side note. So I'm doing a study, actually this is from that. I'm doing a study with our residents at the hospital. We had so many cases that I thought we could actually look at endoscopy findings from cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome. So we could actually find out what was shown on endoscopies, because we had this huge database of patients. This is actually from that database. So you can see these are our numbers of patients that had intractable nausea and vomiting, and then a secondary diagnosis of cannabis use. No, actually, I shouldn't say diagnosis. They actually had a urine drug screen positive for cannabis, or had on their social history said they used cannabis. And by a year, you can see these went dramatically up.
Are they going back to using, and this is happening again to them?
Yeah, so we constantly have the argument that, if the only treatment for this is to stop using cannabis. And they always tell us, it's not the cannabis. Quit telling us it's the cannabis. The last 10 doctors told me it's the cannabis. I don't want you to tell me it's the cannabis. It just keeps happening. The hard part, this is actually a research article on it, and the point I wanted to say is that the total cost for combined ED visits and radiologic evaluations was on average $76,920.92 per patient. So if you look at that, you're talking just for the cannabinoid hyperemesis alone is a lot of money. Which sounds like a lot, but you have to think about these patients are recurrently coming in. They usually get 2 nurses, a tech, a doctor. There's the room they're taking up. Our wait times have, the last shift I left, and I like where I work. I'm not trying to badmouth where I work, but it was 8 hours to get back to see a doctor because it's full. And I apologize, I was going to get back to this on your question. One of the things once I went to do this study with the resident, I tried to do a literature review specifically on cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome. And one of the first studies I found was actually from the Journal of Forensic Science. There's been several deaths from electrolyte abnormalities and renal failure, so their kidneys stop working because of how dehydrated they get from the vomiting, which was something I did not expect. Motor vehicle collisions. So this is our Colorado data. This is our number of statewide traffic fatalities. We were doing actually a really good job. We went from 535, we had it down to about that 447, and then 2011, that's that magic year, we flipped, and we're now at record numbers. We had 632 in 2018. If you look at the percentage that are positive for marijuana, again, that same steady increase. We're down to 21.3% in 2017. Had a drop in 2018, but that about 20% or so of our traffic fatalities are positive for cannabis.
The majority of ours are as well, higher than alcohol, is from only marijuana.
It's massive. And they talk about, well, alcohol and cannabis actually have an additive effect. So the impairment is more than just either substance alone. What I tend to see is that these are different than alcohol. So where alcohol people tend to be swervy, they can't walk on a straight line. And so you were talking about these, how do I drug screen them? It's different than alcohol, and part of that is what we do see, when I'm driving home, I'll see these people, they're driving 35 miles an hour in the 65 zone, but they're not paying attention. They're driving straight through the stop sign, straight through the traffic light, not noticing the person who's walking in the road. It's different than that alcohol swerviness that we're seeing. Cardiopulmonary effects. So there are, it does lead to chronic bronchitis. This picture down here is of the cilia. Those are little hairs in your airway tract that help you get mucus out. And what we see is that if we do biopsies and we look at it under a microscope of people's tissue, that they have way fewer cilia to move mucus out and a large increase in the amount of mucus that they have. So what I am seeing clinically is that probably the most common thing is that people say, I've got a cold, but it's just not going away. I've had it for a month. And that's because you can't cough. You can't clear that out like you used to. So we increased rates of pneumonia, chronic bronchitis. Secondhand cannabis smoke. There was a study that looked at this endovascular endothelial function. So that's how good your blood vessels work, and the impairment was actually greater than secondhand tobacco smoke. I just want to end a lot of that part with the progression. It was funny in talking with Jessica and the Healthy Lamoille Valley, I'm probably butchering that, Lamoille Valley staff, where you guys are now, I feel like we were there 5 years ago. This is what we were talking about 5 years ago. Now, so I talked about the advertising progressed, and it's all progressed. So that what I actually just got done back at home, last week I spoke before our city council, because what it's progressed to is that now we're trying, the industry is trying to move into what's called hospitality lounges. And so that means that we want to have marijuana clubs. One of the things we were really proud about in Pueblo, Colorado, was we were one of the first in the nation to ever ban indoor smoking of any kind. So you couldn't smoke in bowling alleys, restaurants, libraries, bookstores. And we actually one of the docs there did a big article in the Journal of the American Medical Association that showed that dramatically improved and decreased our number of heart attacks and strokes. But now this is actually built into this act is an exception to the Colorado Clean Indoor Air Act. So you can't smoke cigarettes, but you can smoke marijuana in bowling alleys, restaurants. So this is it's already been passed at a state level. We can opt in or out at a local level, so I was just meeting as part of our medical society with our local city council to ask them to opt out of this. Point being, I keep talking about if you give a mouse a cookie, this keeps progressing, and this will keep progressing. You might stop advertising, they might not have advertising at this point, but I guarantee you, I've been down this road, they have paid lobbyists, and they stand to make a lot of money off of this. And so don't think for a second they're not going to be back with their lobbyists the next time, and the next time, and the next time. And as essentially a volunteer staff who's trying to do this for the good of society, you're never going to be able to match that. I want to end with, I asked one of my nurses, I said, this was when I was first going to do one of these talks, actually. I was supposed to speak to our Department of Public Health and said, kind of, what do you guys think I should say? And the nurse literally turned around, and there was one of our psychotic patients and one of our cannabinoid hyperemesis patients, and show them this. So with that in mind, this is still, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I just have to ask the question because I'm worried. I mean, is there no backlash in Colorado? Is there no response yet from the constituents?
So it's happening now. But the hard part is, I've even heard it even here, is like, well, there's nothing we can do. It's too late. It's inevitable. And I think there's still a lot of that mentality, well, we passed it. What are we going to do? The voters already voted it in. But I will say, this is just anecdotally, the mood has changed. When it first happened, everybody was thinking we were going to fund our schools, we were going to have money for prevention, we were going to be able to make it safe because the black market was unsafe, so if we can regulate it, then we can have a controlled product and we can keep it safe. A commercialized market that wants to make money doesn't want to do that. They want to have a higher potency and they want to sell a product. The other thing that ended up happening is when we taxed it, that meant the black market could undercut them because now you can do it at home and you have a lot more. So I don't know if that, so anyway, to answer your question, even the physicians, when this first came out 5 years ago, got some flack. There was just a guy from Dartmouth actually, that wrote an article that's kind of, I don't want to say slammed physicians, but sort of blamed physicians for not getting involved. And it's true, I don't think physicians were very involved 5 years ago. But on this latest, when we could talk to the hospitality lounges, 98%, there's only one guy who's a little bit of a different physician, but all of our physicians voted on to saying, we don't want this, please do something about it. Now the Colorado Medical Society is really active in printing articles and saying that, and maybe, but it's hard. Now we have to reverse a clock that's already happened. So if you guys could not do that, it would really be helpful.
I know when the vote for legalizing marijuana came up here, there was tremendous outcry from the physicians at the University of Vermont and the police, and there was a lot of, but it didn't make any difference. And do you know who Dr. Barbara Bertha Madras is?
Oh, yeah.
Well, she came right before we were going to vote here, and she came to Montpelier and gave talks. She made herself available at the State House all day long. Not one person from the legislature asked her to a meeting, talked to her, nothing. She gave 2 talks, one to the public, which probably a group like us showed up, and then she gave one specifically for the legislators. One woman from Heinsberg, I don't know who she is, but she was the only one that showed up, and then the vote went through. So I was so disappointed because her talk was really incredible. I don't know how you wake people up.
So I think what happened in Pueblo is that people saw this. People saw people out on the street acting bizarre. People had people knocking at their doors at 3 a.m, blaming them for spying on them, and was like, I don't even know who you are. When that starts happening and it starts affecting you, suddenly it became more real and people have turned against it. I don't think we're going to allow the marijuana clubs in Pueblo, which thank goodness I think we'll actually win that fight. It'll be our first win. I want to just get through these, show them this so you can kind of get one more idea of what this looks like in real practice. So this is actually, I normally work the day shift, but sometimes we all take our turn and work the overnight shifts. This is the last set of a week of nights I did. It was at the 4th of July weekend. So that my one recent shift, this was a teenage patient. He was running in the middle of the street. He had some kind of like a metal rod and hitting moving cars in traffic with this metal rod. He had reportedly assaulted one of his buddies and had been running through. He was tackled and tased by the police. When he came in, he was being held down by 3 police officers. I don't know, but I believe there were like 5 paramedics holding him down. He'd been given 5 of Haldol, 2 of Versed, and 50 of Benadryl. That's a massive amount of meds. That's meant to take someone down. He still came in a spit mask. When the paramedics, I asked him, what did he tell you he did? He said that he did, hopefully this is okay to say, but this is, quote, I did chlamydia and meth. He said he'd been using marijuana waxes. He had punched a police officer, spit on the police officers and EMS personnel. Again, they were all holding him down. He was just yelling incoherently. he was being so combative and violent, we couldn't even restrain him without him punching and kicking people. So I actually planned, I'm just gonna have to intubate this guy. He's assaulting everyone here, meaning I'm gonna put a breathing tube in. So I gave him 10 milligrams of intramuscular Versed, so a shot in his buttocks, and he just kind of calmed down a little bit. His urine drug screen actually didn't come back positive for amphetamines, it only came back positive for marijuana. We did get a CAT scan of his head and his cervical spine. It showed that he had what's called pneumomediastinum, or air in the chest that you can get. He actually, with all that trauma, had a history of hemophilia A and had not been taking his things. Luckily, that was okay. But he actually developed rhabdo that's when your muscles start to break down from fighting against restraints, and had to be admitted to the hospital. Second patient, same shift. This guy had been apprehended by the police after he had been shoplifting. He had what the police thought was more of a seizure to escape arrest than a true seizure. His urine drug screen was positive for opiates, meth, and cannabis. I actually discharged him after we medically cleared him to go to jail. He actually came back a second time because he tried to run away from the police, so they tackled him. I saw him twice that night. Another guy had a laceration to his leg. He dropped a wine glass on it and had got a cut on it. I had to put some stitches in. He drinks about 10 beers a day and smokes cannabis daily. This other guy was in a bar fight. He said he was part of the Aryan Brotherhood. Really strange. He had these odd episodes where he would kind of sit bolt upright, wouldn't say anything, and then just lie back flat and go totally unresponsive. We kind of have if people aren't protecting their airway, meaning if they throw up and they can't move out of the way, we end up putting a breathing tube in. So this guy actually ultimately did get intubated. His alcohol level was only like 40, which not enough that I would think would cause that. Usually, if he was in the 400s, that might be the case. And then positive for cannabis. This another patient had a history of PTSD. He was taking a number of meds for it. He was trying to self-treat symptoms because the fireworks were going off. His urine drug screen was positive for amphetamines and cannabis. Came in just because his PTSD was not treated. This patient, she'd been drank till she became unresponsive, brought in by police. Her children had been taken into custody by the police because they didn't have anywhere else to go. She was also a daily cannabis user. Patient came in for suicidal ideation. She had a plan to overdose on pills, history of cocaine, snorting heroin, and cannabis use. This is all that same, this is one shift. Patient was out we have a big reservoir, the Pueblo Reservoir. People go water skiing and wakeboarding and stuff on it. She was there. She had been punched after somebody tried to sell her marijuana products, and she refused. So got punched in the face. We had to put sew up a big cut above her eyebrow. We did get a CAT scan. That looked fine. She was a daily cannabis user as well. This is another interesting one that I think brings up a good point. This patient came in with left knee pain. He'd crashed on his motorcycle the 2 days prior. Instead of coming in, he just said he was going to treat himself with marijuana, and so he was at home smoking large amounts of marijuana without any relief. So finally came in, he actually had a midline patella fracture. Patient with undifferentiated abdominal pain, vomiting, and diarrhea. She had normal labs, normal CT scan, normal stool studies, history of a daily marijuana use. She actually had quit 3 months ago. This other one had come in kind of similar, had chronic left scapular, left shoulder pain, smokes marijuana daily. But that was his plan for treatment. So he'd never been to physical therapy, never got appropriate treatment for his pain. This is another, was a teenager. He had what's called epididymitis, smokes cigarettes and uses marijuana 2 to 3 times a week. This last one is actually not cannabis related, but I thought I'd throw it in because it completed the night. This was a guy who punched through a glass window. He actually severed his radial artery. He was hypotensive. We had to give him a blood transfusion. And he eventually got taken to the operating room for repair. That was one night. So this gets repeated. I'm getting the sign that I'm out of time, but this gets repeated. This few ones I want to just put on here. Assaulted in the park, daily cannabis user. This one, so Denver actually just legalized mushrooms. And so this guy heard that we legalized mushrooms, so wanted to try them. He came in after he was seeing demons. This patient was on our state hospital grounds, said he wanted to blow his brains out. When I walked in there, we have our psych rooms are pretty, just a mattress on the floor so that they can't hurt themselves or anyone else. We kind of had a blanket over his head, and when I went to touch him, he jumped up and started swinging, so I had to kind of back off, and then he just laid down and didn't respond anymore. Again, positive for amphetamines and cannabinoids. Let's see, I'm going to highlight a couple of these. These are all that same bunch of shifts. Yeah, this one is kind of found. This guy was just sitting on the curb by bystanders. He kind of had these weird, uncoordinated movements. He was another one when I removed the blanket. He just kind of flailed around. He ended up urine drug screen positive for amphetamines and cannabinoids, sat there for 10 hours because there was nowhere to put him. So eventually he got discharged to our detox. This was one patient presents for auditory hallucinations, voices telling him to stab himself and others with knives, states having visual hallucinations of tiny trolls eating his legs. Urine drug screen only positive for cannabis, stated he was a daily cannabis user. So a few extra things I noted out of that. All or nearly all of those were either on Medicaid or uninsured patients. You also noticed that was usually co-occurring with other substances. I actually just kept tabs of my patients because I was thinking this is kind of a lot. About 2/3 of the patients I saw were some sort of drug related. That very last shift, 10 of the 15 patients I saw were drug related, and that includes alcohol. I just kind of ran some numbers, called the people who do some of our billing, probably about $5,000 total when you get the lab work and the CAT scans and the different fees that get added on per patient. I would guess you're probably looking at, if you have 10 patients of that amount, $50,000 for every one of those shifts. Those aren't exact numbers, those are just estimates. By the time you add in your inpatient stays, your ICU stays, getting endoscopies, the ambulance is running on these people, the police are getting involved, your cost is huge. So just to summarize, we discussed that substance dependence hijacks the brain and the natural reward system. Cannabis potency has dramatically increased. Cannabis use can lead to multiple adverse mental health outcomes, psychosis, suicide, changes in your judgment or complex decision making. Cannabis use can lead to recurrent vomiting called cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome. And then cannabis use primes the brain to suffer from substance dependence. I'll wait so you can take a picture. Yeah, I'm just going to finish because we've got 2 slides and I'll get to you. So what can you do? When I first started doing these presentations and I was kind of new and green at it, I still probably am to some degree, but one of the things that people said is, you got to tell people what they can do. So the biggest thing that you can do is actually get involved, and I think the easiest way to do that is write a letter to your legislators. That's probably the biggest thing and easiest thing you can do, and then to move on, and once you get educated, to educate others. These are some things that Jessica gave me that you can have here. So you have the healthvermont.gov, that's the Let's Talk Cannabis. You have those forms that I think were given. Same with the Parent Up. This is the article that I wrote. If you put that in Google, it pops up. It's a free open access article in the Western Journal of Emergency Medicine. So that's when I said I was asked to write that big review article, that's it. So you can look that up. So of course, Healthy Lamoille Valley. I have the hardest time with that. And then this is kind of the contact information for those you have. And we'll go to questions, I think.
I have actually 3. One of them is, do you see anyone out there yet trying to create a maximum THC, like to create that standard so that people know what they're getting? I know things are labeled, right? It does say like 5, 10, or whatever, but what that is for putting a cap on potency.
So that's probably the biggest thing. So Libby Stout, she's an addiction psychiatrist that I work with. That's her biggest thing. If we could cap potency, it's never gone anywhere. So no one's actually ever agreed to it. The justification is that, well, then the black market's just going to create these high potency products. And so no, it's never happened as far as I'm aware. I wish it would.
I've worked with clients who are recovering heroin and crack users, and so they smoke pot as a lesser coping mechanism.
Yeah.
What do you have to say about that?
So as I said, I do Suboxone. That's my medication-assisted treatment. I also do Vivitrol. So when I work in my clinic, it's kind of a side job for me. I work a half day a month doing medication-assisted treatment for addicts. The reason I did that is to start our ER program so we could get people treated in the ER for substance dependence. The way I handle that when I'm in clinic is I move down a continuum. So sometimes people aren't ready to talk about cannabis because they're stuck in a meth and heroin world. And in that world at that time, the way I approach it is I ignore the cannabis and I get them to a point, but I don't ignore it the whole time. Once I have somebody that's stabilized, which is what Suboxone does for them, they can finally be stabilized and start making appropriate decisions. They can get out of that where at one time, they were stealing, they were kind of doing bad things just to get money to cope. And once they've converted out of that lifestyle, and they tend to have this, oh my goodness moment, where I've been doing this and I'm finally out of it, I can finally see clearly, and now I'm going to start making changes in my life to fix it. That's the point that I will say, hey, you know what? And one of the other things that's hurting you, just so you know, is cannabis. And if you cut out the cannabis, I actually think it's really going to help you be successful. I don't push it. It's just basically that conversation. But I found the majority of my patients will actually come back and say, you know what? I actually cut down a lot and I feel a lot better.
That's great. I have one more. The British fellow who did a TED Talk about the mice who were addicted to heroin, you know the TED Talk I'm talking about? The mice who were alone in the cages and all they had was heroin and they drank all the heroin and were crazy. But then when they were put in the box with all kinds of enrichment games and other mice, they didn't go to the heroin. And I just wonder if community or culturally, if you see isolation and like sort of breakdown of community being relevant here in this story of use.
Yes, thank you so much for bringing that up. So, because I've gotten involved in this, we're always looking at, well, how do you fix it? What do you do? The best model that I've ever seen been done, and what I think is the answer to this, is probably outside of legalization or not. It's the Icelandic model, they call it. And the Icelandic model was, if we give people healthy activities to do, they're significantly less likely to use other substances. So what Iceland did is invested in sports, getting kids to sports activities, and getting kids outside. I'm kind of a huge advocate. I think Vermont's going to be with me on this, that when you get outside and you hike out in the mountains, you feel better. And you're much less likely to go to using other substances. I think that's a really simple intervention that can be done. And as far as do people with substance abuse tend to go alone, yeah, I think they do, and I think there's a multitude of reasons for that. Not the least of which is that dopamine change that happens in your brain where you don't feel good and you end up being much more alone. But I'm really glad you brought that up. I think one of the biggest things we can do is if you just tell people don't do it, I just don't think it works. Just say no doesn't work very well. But if you tell people, one, there's a reason. I'm not here because I'm trying to tell you don't do it. I'm telling you so you can make an educated and informed decision. And then two, do something else that's positive instead. Get that dopamine from the way we want you to get that dopamine. And then you'll actually feel good and you can stay feeling good.
Katie had a question.
Well, I just want to thank you for coming. I mean, everything you said is worth 100% behind. I have a question about quantitative THC, like, blood, urine, breathalyzer, like how can we get a number so that we can make a line sort of like we have for alcohol? And because if we can't dial back the legislators from legalization, where do we say this was, I've been in the common people have been in the car, behind a car, where you know that you're breathing secondhand smoke from the car in front of you.
Yeah.
That has to be over a limit. And, when's the roadside test versus PR test? Like, so we can sort of say, yeah, you're at a 0.08 equivalent or whatever.
Right. So, as you probably know, the reason it's difficult is because THC is a fat-soluble molecule. And that means it absorbs in all people's fatty tissues, the adipose tissue, and it's slowly released over time. That tolerance thing that we see is also different, which happens in alcohol as well. People all know functional alcoholics. I know plenty of functional heroin and meth addicts, actually, that go to work and function just fine. Some of those same things can happen in cannabis, so the argument is that you can't measure impairment by a level, which was, I think, argued initially when alcohol was getting levels and stuff too. But I think it's much more difficult because your levels of that slow release mechanism are hard to track and get that level. So my personal opinion is I don't think we're ever going to have it. It's not going to exist like a breathalyzer does because the effects are so variable on people, which I don't think is reassurance. I think that makes it even more, I can't predict what somebody's going to have based on that, which makes it more likely, if you're positive, I think you're just going to have to assume that it's active. And I know there's people that will disagree with me on that, but I think if you're having symptoms. Thank you guys for coming. These questions here. So what would you say to someone who might be using marijuana? So I can tell you what I tell my patients. I have patients all the time. Just like other things, not everyone develops psychosis or suicidality. There are plenty of patients who come in because they broke their arm or broke their leg or whatever, and as part of my social history, they tell me they're using cannabis. What I tell them is, you know what, I don't care what you do from some moral standpoint, but I think it's important that you know that this might affect your brain development. It might affect your ability to interact. It might lead to increased paranoia down the road if you keep using, and that can lead to psychosis and schizophrenia. It might lead you to vomit on a daily basis. And a lot of the times those things are miserable. And the way I put it is almost with regularity, I can kind of point, do you hear that guy down the hall? That's the cannabis. So if you don't want to end up there, my goal is to keep you from ending up there. And again, I don't care what you do from some moral standpoint, but I think you should know. Does the brain activity associated with marijuana use mimic other substance-seeking brain activity? So yeah, I'm giving a presentation tomorrow that's to healthcare providers, and it's got a little bit more like graphs and data and stuff in it. But if you look at those things, when I use a substance and I can measure those dopamine spikes, THC has that same dopamine spike as meth, as heroin. They all have that same dopamine spike. They all pretty much do it very similarly. And yes, THC has that same interaction. There's actually another great study. This was out of Connecticut. I don't know how they got this past an IRB, but they did. If I give people IV THC, so they gave them at 0, 2.5, and 5 milligrams of IV THC, 100% of those patients actually developed at least symptoms of anxiety. Multiple of them developed paranoia. I don't know if that answers the question, but I think as an FYI, that seems to be part of the factor. Yeah, I'm going to go here and...
Two questions. The first one is, would you make this presentation available? As I look around this room, I don't see any of the legislators from this area here. If I'm missing you, I apologize. And, and I serve on a board where we have actually a senator and one of our local state reps, and so I'd like to, be able to give this to these guys, because they, at least on the rep standpoint, he voted yes for the legalization.
So yes, I think Jessica's going to make it available on the Healthy Lamoille Valley.
It's important that he knew about this. So we met with him beforehand, Michelle and I, with Dan, for example, and they know this data going in. It's still, there's so much public pressure. But I'm just saying, it's good for them to see it, but it was not, they were not unaware of some of these things.
Well, and I'll support you in one of the things you said. On an earlier issue, I was on our school board, and I was trying to get legislative matter passed. And so I talked to one of our state senator here, and I said, Rich, what's the best way to get somebody's attention? And he said, the best way is to write a letter. He said, I'm inundated with emails, and to the point where often, and our legislators don't have aides or anything like that. It's a true citizen, I'll call citizen legislature. And the best thing you can do is write, because then that stands a better chance of getting your attention than emails and even phone calls. So that's just a word of advice or information. The second question I have is, what has all this stuff done to the physical makeup of your ER? We just recently, we have a small 25-bed Laxus hospital in Lamoille County. We just spent about $20,000 creating I'll call it a psych room. And it's basically what you described. It's empty, and we basically can't afford to, keep replicating this. Or even, one of the things you said was, the only thing that'll work is showers. Well, I don't think any of our emergency rooms or whatever have showers in them. So, well, that's the thing,
So there's there's several parts to that, and I'm going to get, this is on what's truly happened. We used to have 2 hospitals in Pueblo. Pueblo's got about 160,000 people. There were already only 2 major hospitals. Our payer mix was not very good, so we had a high level of Medicaid and uninsured patients. Well, when this happened, we were the first to legalize, and our county commissioner said he wanted to go all in. Because of the way our economics worked, we really wanted we were going to make this our new industry, as we were going to sell marijuana. So a ton of people moved to Pueblo to start in the new industry, but these were people who wanted to work in the marijuana industry. Well, there weren't those jobs. There were no jobs in the marijuana industry, and the people who came to work in the marijuana industry weren't educated. I'll just stop there. And what they did, our homeless shelter that used to see about 4,000 patients a year, by July of that year had already seen 7,000. And these people were just overwhelming all the staff. There was the whole homeless shelter had started getting violent because there weren't enough rooms for people and they had to turn people away. People were showing up and taking their clothes off in the middle of the floor to try to do things to get rooms. So eventually what happened is we closed our homeless shelter. The homeless shelter closed entirely. They just couldn't take it. Their staff were getting assaulted. So what happened then is the second hospital, they were losing money financially now, and they actually closed. They didn't close entirely, but they went down to half staff. So we got inundated. We just have had, like I said, we went from getting people back to be seen in less than an hour, maybe 2 hours max most of the time. And I took a lot of pride when I told somebody where I worked. They would be like, oh man, I work at Parkview Medical Center. And they would say, I love Parkview Medical Center. You saved my grandma's life, or things like that. And I love doing that. It's now moved, so people are waiting 8 to 10 hours to be seen. And now, what I really don't like is I say I work at Parkview Medical Center and I hear, the last time I was there was some guy screaming in the hallway. I saw some guy defecating in the middle of the waiting room. That sort of thing has completely changed, and it's not the same as where I used to work. So it's affected multiple parts. It's affected the way I feel about my job. It's affected the way my patients feel about the care they're getting. I don't like people having to wait 10 hours, but there's no room. The hospital's full. And until a patient gets discharged from upstairs, I can't put a new patient in the bed. Now there's multiple factors. Again, the hospital closed was a big part of that. The people moving in was a second part of that. But the other is that we've increased our medical problems by the numbers I've kind of shown there.
We have a lower wait time if you want to talk after we.
You did say you like Vermont, so.
Hi everyone, I'm Allison. I work for Healthy Lamoille Valley. A couple of things. One is the idea of writing legislators. We don't just do policy work on a statewide level, but we also do it on a local level, the 16 towns in our area. So it's not just there's only one option, opt in or opt out, right? There are many options for policy. There are many policy options that relate to cannabis and all of the substances that towns can turn into ordinances or use, and there's a variety of them. So there are many options. There's nuance, just so that you know, and more, we'll be putting more out on that, but so that you know that you can also talk to the local folks in the towns to make a difference. Two, I love that Brad's talking about the Icelandic model. We've talked about that before, and the idea of positive, healthy activities, but also just to keep in mind, it's not only that if we just program people into activities and keep people busy, it's not the same as teaching people the skills of how to engage in healthy behaviors on your own. So that level that sometimes in some of my work is called leisure literacy development as a protective factor is really valuable. Teaching the skills of how to engage, not just planning and having the opportunities. And I asked Brad a question this morning that I hope will answer for everybody else. I asked about all the data that he's showing and what they're collecting in the ER and elsewhere, and what variables are missing that they're not able to collect, which he alluded to, but what we might think about collecting just so that we can try to understand our situation as it unfolds, and what you might have to say about what should we be measuring, what should we be looking at now, taking a step back in the past years, and what should we continue to look at in our community of data points.
So first off, you're already doing a great job. Michelle Salvadore, did I get that right? Is doing an excellent job. You have that data. One of the things that you have that I wish we had when I was there is this Healthy Lamoille Valley, Vermont. We didn't have that. We had our health department, but we didn't have what you have. So thank you for what you've done. You're already well above where we were when we started. As far as what data I would collect, I think you hit the nail on the head. Well, what about these psychosis patients? I would start now to figuring out, one, you have to get the diagnosis codes consistent with what that is. So if somebody's presenting with psychosis, it needs to be diagnosed as some sort of a consistent marker of psychosis so that you can track it. That's going to be a lot harder thing to bring in, but I think if that's tracked, then you can actually track it and see what kind of differences you're making there. As far as I've seen, Vermont's similar to Colorado, that you're tracking your suicide data. The other thing that I would track is exactly what you were already mentioning, things that are in regards to the Icelandic model. So the newest thing that I would like to do, we're working on something called Parks RX. It's a national program to have physicians write prescriptions to go to the park. What I want to do is take these patients and I want to look at people who get prescriptions to go to the park to see if they use the ER less. And I also think you could track, do they use substances less? What things actually work when you're looking at preventive measures? Because I think those are things we actually don't know. We have a lot of ideas. I think there's a pretty good data that this Icelandic model or getting outside and getting involved help. I think we should really track it, and then you can work legislatively to push it. And I skipped one here that I want to come back to.
I have 2 questions. How do we compare, how does the U.S. compare to other countries in marijuana use? Do you know?
I don't know off the top of my head. I don't know numbers. I will say, so I lived in Denmark for a couple years, and I would say that it's different. For whatever reason, when the U.S. seems to go for something, we go all in. Whereas Denmark might have it legalized, people didn't really use it that much. They weren't using it 8 times a day and weren't pushing for a 90% potency. Whereas in the U.S., as soon as it became legal, we wanted the most potent product we could get and use it as much as we can, and then try to push our boundaries as to where the boundary was at. I don't know the numbers, but that's been my just anecdotal experience living in both places.
And the other question I have is that if there was an ICD code for the urine testing, would there be an amount in the urine that we could use as a marker, as like we do with alcohol?
So probably. So the other study that, there's an Institute of Cannabis Research that's actually in Pueblo now. It's part of the university. They're actually similar to what's happening everywhere. They're going to offer a major in cannabis now. But I was working with one of the professors there, and what we're going to hopefully move to is actually tracking how much cannabinoids are in the cannabinoid hyperemesis patients, and actually then send this off to a lab that can differentiate what types of cannabinoids are there, and then how much of the different cannabinoids are there. It may be that in the future you can get there through tests like that. I think that's a long ways away.
But if it's a matter of an ICD code, that is pathetic, I think. I mean, there should be something we could do about that.
So it's hard, because a psychiatrist has a lot broader look at this. In other words, is the cannabis causing schizophrenia, or did they have schizophrenia before they started using cannabis? So should I diagnose them as cannabinoid-induced psychosis, or should I diagnose them with schizophrenia or schizophreniform disorder with psychotic features? And that's where that line really gets blurry when I'm trying to track total numbers of psychosis. And then a lot of times when the ER doc sees them, they might just pick the drug that they think is the most involved. So if they have a drug screen that's positive for meth, cannabis, alcohol, and they're having psychotic features, the doc at the time might say, this is just methamphetamine abuse, and that's the only thing that makes the diagnostic code in the chart. It's just what got put on the chart. And so I think until that gets consistent, it's going to be hard to track. And as an ER doc who's is moving people as fast as I can through a department and really trying to do a good job, I'll admit, I'm not, even me knowing this, I'm not spending much time. If it's methamphetamine abuse, I may not put on the psychosis part of it.
I just wanted to bring up the one thing that Dr. Madras said that we should be asking our legislators is to disclose if they're receiving any funding from any lobbyists for pro-use. I would suggest that as a question.
So that gets interesting, because what I found in Colorado is they didn't get funding, they got campaign contributions.
Yes, I think that's going to be the place to look. It's all on the Secretary of State website.
Because like I said, I went to that, Bertha Madras she's a psychobiologist at Harvard. And she's like the drug, she's written many, many articles on opioid addiction, going all over the place to speak. She's even with the, is she still on the task force of the drug? I think she's one of the reasons why the federal government doesn't approve marijuana.
She probably is.
Yeah. But anyhow, she was there at the State House right before the vote. Nobody bothered to invite her to the meeting. No one showed up. It was appalling to me. So I lost a lot of faith. I put on front porch forum in our area and they didn't show up.
The last thing I want to say, though, just before I'm ended, is again, it's awesome you guys are here. I know you've got a lot to do in life, so it's amazing you guys are here. Thanks for doing what you're doing. I think the positive difference that you can make is they talk about a pebble going in a pond and rippling out. That ripple effect can be huge, and I think you guys can make a big difference and hopefully avoid the junk we're dealing with.
Please join me.
Thank you.